this wonderful event come to celebrate Jamie's award of a personal chair and to deliver this inaugural lecture. It's great to be able to, I think inaugural lectures are really wonderful occasions because it's one of the few occasions when we can sort of step back from the cut and thrust of our daily lives and really find out what lies behind an individual member of staff who is a key member of staff, but understand the sort of motivations, inspirations and influences on a career in a sort of more reflective and relaxed context, not only in front of colleagues, but with friends and other associates, some of who have come from some distance. So welcome to this event, whether you're here in person or you're actually online. So it's a rather very special occasion. So Jamie started his academic career with an undergraduate degree in electronic engineering in Southampton, and then stayed in Southampton for some time, completing a PhD in statistics, computer vision and machine learning, and then following that with a postdoc position in electronics in Southampton. He then moved to the Plymouth Marine Lab in 2003, stayed there until 2014, some of which time he held a European Space Agency research fellowship. He arrived in CJS on the Penryn campus in 2014 as a senior lecturer and became associate professor in Earth observation in 2017. It's clear from the abstract, which has been circulated, the description, that Jamie is going to be talking a lot about how his fundamental expertise in maths and engineering has been brought to bear on a number of aspects of environmental science, and that's going to be fascinating. Jamie's background at the Plymouth Marine Lab has been a really important component and the beginning of the development of a very strong relationship between the department and the Plymouth Marine Lab, which continues to the present time, both in terms of additional members of staff being appointed, Bob Bruin, and also honorary lecturers. So that's been a key component of the sort of strategic relationships that Jamie's been able to develop. He's also, of course, a core element of the remote sensing strength that we have within the department. I'd say Jamie's recognised for, at least this is my impression, rigorous evidence-based quantitative carbon cycle research, but exceptionally with a very strong commitment to personal and institutional responsibility in the face of the climate and environmental crisis. So it's not just a question of doing the science, it's how that has a bearing on how we all live our lives, how we organise ourselves in institutions. And Jamie's taken on a series of roles, both within the department, but also now within the wider university, in terms of advising on carbon accounting, carbon budgeting and so on, which I think has been very influential and continues to be very influential. And there's another element in which Jamie has, in terms of sort of the impacts of the research and the impacts of doing the research, is your work on space junk, essentially, the waste byproducts in the space arena of satellite technology and the implications that has. So here we go. I hope this is, I'm sure this is going to be a marvellous experience, and there we are. Welcome.
Thank you, James. Thanks very much for that introduction. It was very, very kind. I wanted to thank everyone for coming, really, to begin with. It's amazing to see so many friendly faces here, some of which have travelled quite a long way to be here, so it's really amazing. And also people online, it's really great to have everyone come and see what I'm going to be talking about. And my daughter, a few weeks ago, gave me some great advice, and she said, "Don't make it boring, Dad." So hopefully I haven't, and you will enjoy the next 40 or so minutes. It's, for me, has been a really a very different, unexpected journey, because as James mentioned, I've gone from studying computer vision and human motion at ground level through to then traveling up, luckily or unluckily, not physically, but traveling up to studying the Earth from space and the environment of space, but also looking at space technology and helping to design satellites and understand the impacts that these space launches are actually having on our higher atmosphere. And there's been lots of twists and turns along the way, but it's not really what I would call a kind of classical academic journey. This is a picture of me when I was age 7. And the main reason I wanted to put this up here is because, just to illustrate, there was one point in time when I actually had some hair. And I kind of wish I had hair like that now. It would be pretty cool. But I'm one of 4 children. So these are my 2 sisters and my brother. And later in life, my older sister that you can see on the left there is actually one of the reasons why I ended up at university, because when I came to apply for university, I was pretty lazy and I couldn't really be bothered to complete the application forms. And she actually encouraged me to do that. And so without her, I wouldn't be standing here today. At school, I really enjoyed science, but I struggled at mathematics and English as well. And as a result, I actually took more of a vocational choice in education than going to college. And I studied at the beginning more general engineering, so things like working in a machine shop and using welding equipment like this. And I was absolutely terrible at it. My efforts for welding really turned into they looked a bit like colanders rather than actually joining any metal together. But I very quickly had and created this kind of real passion for electronics. And this is an example of some instrumentation I built during my time at college. And I also, during this time, developed a real passion and interest and keenness for maths. And prior to this point, I'd really struggled, but I met my maths tutor who really encouraged me to sort of strive for much higher level of maths. And I studied further mathematics. And this was really the only reason I managed to actually get a place at university. And I was lucky enough to get a place at the University of Southampton at on the electronic engineering course. At the time, it was the best electronic course in the country. And I had an amazing time. It was incredibly exciting, being with people who were as passionate as I was about mathematics and electronics. And consequently, I ended up, for most of my university time, actually living with computer scientists and software engineers and computer engineers. And so consequently, you could describe my life as sketches out of the Big Bang Theory TV show. And I often watch episodes of this, and it feels more like a documentary than it is actually a fictional story. For the last 20 or so years, I spent a lot of time surfing. This is, I think, the only picture I have of me surfing in the water. And as you can see, I'm not actually even looking at the camera, which wasn't a great shot. But I love surfing, and I spend as much time as I can in the water. I also spend a lot of time climbing. This is a climb that I did last year with one of my climbing partners, which is, you can see my climbing partner, which is the red arrow. We're about 30 meters or so up on a Cornish cliff. But I love that feeling of exposure and kind of the privilege of being in a place where not very many people have been, and the views are absolutely amazing. But I spent much of my time at university and during my postdoc and my PhD kayaking. This is a river that 2 of us did over in Canada while we were over there for a few weeks kayaking. And for this particular river, we actually had to climb our way in and haul and lower our equipment in on ropes, and then run a series of waterfalls. But we paddled across the whole of Europe, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Austria. We even went as far afield as Turkey and up to Norway. And this is a rather blurry picture, but this is a group of us in Norway. We're on a kayaking trip. We went out there to catch the snowmelt, and the snowmelt that year was actually late, and so everything was frozen solid. So it made for a very, very cold trip. But we did find some pretty amazing rivers while we were there. But shortly after this photo was taken, two of the group, a massive row broke out between two of them. And the reason, the focus for the row was because of the way someone had served a piece of cake at the lunchtime during the day, which sounds completely ridiculous and was. But the point was, it was a kind of reflection of the fact that of the pressure we were under doing these kind of risky activities, but also how we were constantly relying on each other for our own safety. But all of these exploits, these what my mum would probably call quite risky activities, have learned, it taught me a lot of key skills that are completely transferable, and I have transferred to my research. The need for good team cooperation, how to persuade people, and encouragement, reliance on others, negotiation skills, the need to make decisions, sometimes under pressure. These are all key skills, and they're really applicable, and I have exploited a lot of them during my research. And over the years, this has helped me to build a really strong research team. So these are all the people that I've worked with over the last 20 or so years in my research group, particularly here at the university. So these are current and former members. And I've been incredibly lucky to work with these people. And so much of the advances I'm now going to talk about are as much their achievements as they are mine. During my degree, and right straight after my degree, I actually worked for Marconi Infrared, which is a defense industry company. I initially, I did a year out placement with them, so I was a work experience student. They initially put me in the clean rooms, and they quickly realized that wasn't a good place for me because I just kept breaking things. And they transferred me to building instrumentation. And slowly over time, I became more useful, and they actually took me on after my degree as a contractor. So I must have been some use to them. But after that, I then started my PhD. And so this we were interested in using biometrics and studying biometrics and understanding how we could recognize people by the way they walked, their motion. But to do that first, we obviously had to build a database of people walking so that we could then apply our techniques to and test them against. And this is subject number 11, also known as Mike. And he's walking across the green screening lab that we actually designed and constructed during the postdoc work. So this is the same kind of approaches that early weather forecasts used to use. So that you end up with a really uniform color behind and well lit, and it allows you to extract the human being at the front. So to extract our subject, Mike in this case, we actually developed an early machine learning approach, which learnt through temporal for video sequences, learnt the background conditions, and then allowed you to extract the foreground object, which is the person. So this allowed us to extract the person, and therefore we could apply our techniques just to the motion of the human being. And it turned out it worked really well in the lab, but it also worked really well in the outside environment, in the real world. So this is actually quite a complex scene of a subject walking across a car park, and there's trees moving in the background, there's some people, there's cars moving around. But because the technique is able to learn the background information based on this video sequence, it can then quite easily actually isolate the individual from the frame. And we then use this approach to build the largest gait database that currently was at that point was in existence, and that then allowed us to actually apply our different recognition techniques and successfully identify people by the way they're walking. So I then moved to Plymouth Marine Lab, as James said, and here we were interested in taking satellite observations, so observations from space. And this need to extract a background signal from a foreground, so removing this long-term signal, it's not unique to video sequences. And so the same issue was present here in studying, in this case, harmful algal blooms. So we wanted to be able to extract and identify where the harmful algal bloom were and how it was moving through time. And these plankton can cause problems for wild fisheries and aquaculture, where they in some cases, in this case, they actually remove all the oxygen from the water column, and then they can cause suffocation of the animals in the water. So we first of all built a data processing system to take data from the satellite that was orbiting the Earth, that was covering the UK in this case, and then allowed us to create our video sequence as input. And then we were able to actually successfully isolate the harmful algal bloom. And for the first time, we were able to track its evolution, so its growth and then decay through time. I was then lucky enough to be encouraged. I didn't come up with this idea. It was one of my colleagues at Plymouth Marine Lab to actually apply for a European Space Agency research fellowship. And I was successful in getting one. There was only 15 of these available across the whole of Europe in that particular year. And I was lucky enough to get one. And it meant that I could focus more on my research, but also it meant I could go and spend some time at the labs in the European Space Agency. And these are the labs, the technology development labs in Netherlands, on the coast, by the beach, in fact. And at this technology center, they actually construct satellites and test them prior to launch. And so I was really in my element. I couldn't believe the excitement. It was like a space geek, in a toy shop kind of thing. Everything was available, and I could really get to live my dream, essentially working within this environment. Clearly based on, they'd obviously heard of my welding skills and my skills in the clean labs, because they never let me go anywhere near the clean labs themselves. But I had my main piece of work for my fellowship was theoretical studies. And I wanted to study and understand how gases are moving between the ocean and the atmosphere, which had been studied a lot in situ and in laboratories, but it hadn't really been scaled on a global scale to using satellite observations. And so my fellowship actually resulted in 3 main results, but they all identified problems rather than actually proposing any solutions. So the first one identified the fact it was really hard to apply methods you find in the laboratory to actually using satellite observations. And if you do that, they tend to be quite biased, and therefore it's not an easy task. The second issue identified was the fact that if you confuse your handling of temperature within the water, then it can actually cause very large errors in your calculations. And then the third aspect was the fact that biology can cause some problems. So if you have biological growth, plankton growing at the surface of the water, they change the tension of the water itself, which alters the amount of exchange that occurs across that boundary. So I didn't really achieve a huge amount in results from my fellowship. I just ended up identifying 3 large problems, which I was really lucky with, in the sense that the European Space Agency saw that as an opportunity. So they essentially funded a whole series of projects that came from that to try and isolate and actually address some of these problems that I'd found. The first one of which meant that we were able to transfer knowledge from the sea surface temperature community and apply it to the marine carbonate community. And this allowed us to understand some of the complexities of these issues with confusing temperature data within these calculations. We also held a whole series of workshops to try and bring different parts of these communities together. So we brought together the satellite observation communities with the marine carbonate communities to try and get people to actually discuss and focus on these issues that we've come across. And it's not until now, when I look back at these pictures, that I realize how successful these were, because there's so many really prominent scientists, international scientists within these pictures that we managed to pull together, and many of which I now work with and have continued to work with even to the current day. The 3 red arrows are the people that organize, so myself, Craig and David Wolf, who organize these workshops. We also realized the problem we had, if we wanted to investigate these processes, that we needed some sort of framework in which to actually test our theories and the impacts of different choices. So to do that, we developed a software data processing package, which allowed us to routinely process global level data. And this allowed us to be able to sort of show how gases are moving globally through time and space. So this is actually a short animation. Everywhere that's blue is where gas is going, carbon dioxide is going into the water, and everywhere orange is where it's coming out. And this was the first time that someone had actually released an open source community data approach for doing this. Since then, this package we've continued to use it, and it's been extended and exploited. It's contributed to 24 different journal papers, 4 different PhDs. It's been funded by 9 different projects and that array of funders. And the work has appeared the results from it have appeared in The Guardian, the BBC, and other major news outlets. And clearly they weren't interested in the fact we developed a software package or the fact we were analysing any data. The reason here they picked up on the news is because we described the amount of carbon that was coming out of being taken up by European waters was the equivalent to 2 million double-decker buses worth of carbon dioxide. But it did enable us to begin to start to unpick the theory about the impact of the temperature processes that we had identified at the beginning. And slowly over time, we kind of pieced together different pieces of evidence that allowed us to quantify that the ocean carbon sink was currently, and still is to some extent, underestimated. And the reason why this is important is because globally and from a policy point of view, is that the 2 main constraints on global carbon budgets when they do budgets for guiding government policy, the 2 major constraints are the atmosphere and the ocean. So if you get one of those wrong, everything else, for example, the land's carbon sink strength is obviously in error as well. But the one piece of evidence that was missing was we had our theoretical basis, we had these global scale analyses from lots of different viewpoints that have kind of honed down how confident we were in these temperature influences, but we didn't have any field evidence, actual evidence from measurements at sea that quantified the signal that we claimed existed. So in 2018 and 2019, we had 2 research cruises which went from the UK down to the tip of South America. And on there, we actually instrumented them with a whole range of instruments measuring the exchanges and movements and controls of gas exchange. And some 5 years later, we actually managed to publish the results. And we had, in fact, found the evidence, this in situ evidence, that this process was actually valid and did exist. And it was picked up in The Guardian. They didn't quite get the story right, which is why we then wrote the piece in The Conversation to kind of clarify some of the confusion. But it was really quite exciting to finally, some 17 years after my fellowship at the European Space Agency, that we actually found the field evidence to justify that work. During this time, the application and exploitation of machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches, so neural networks, has really expanded considerably and accelerated. And as a result, the early work we focused on, we were actually doing calculations on a monthly basis, but now we're able to do it on a daily or even 8 daily basis. And so what you can see here are, you'd see storms spinning up. So we can actually track and study the impacts that hurricanes are having as they move across the Atlantic. So you can see the red areas as the storms spin up across the central Atlantic, they're sucking up gas and pulling it out of the water. But then as they head into the Arctic, they're actually pushing gas, the carbon dioxide, back into the water. Alongside that, we also thought maybe we can actually study the chemistry, the water chemistry itself from space. And so to put that into context, essentially what we wanted to do was look at the chemistry at the ocean's surface in the top 1 millimeter of the water. And we wanted to use a satellite that was orbiting about 400 kilometers up. And so that concept seemed initially quite, unfeasible in some sense. So we published this piece of work in 2015, which basically isolated and illustrated the potential measurement you could achieve from a satellite observation. And again, it was picked up in the press. They didn't quite get the story right. You can't watch ocean acidification in real time, but the essence was there. The fact that you could actually study the chemistry from space. And we've since developed these techniques further, and this is an example here. You can actually look at the change in chemistry as a result of the Amazon, the River Amazon plume as it floods out into the Atlantic. And so that kind of tongue you can see is the influence of the Amazon and changes in the alkalinity at the surface of the water. It's also now has been used for guiding conservation. So WWF, for example, have used these data to highlight the plight of coral reefs, but also to guide their conservation efforts, where to focus their efforts, where for the greatest benefit. And we've also started providing these data to US state level resource managers, so where they're using these observations in pH, in this case, to actually guide how their fish stock policy, and also for raising awareness of the conditions that their coastline is actually being impacted by. And these are all being driven by the atmospheric emissions of carbon dioxide, so they're out of the control of those on land. We've also used the same data to actually quantify what the potential impacts are to animals on which we rely for food. So these are fish, the common fish species, cod, through to lobsters. And we've identified how much we actually know of their life cycles and in relation to their changing carbonate conditions, the changing in ocean acidification. And it essentially says that we know very little. So we don't know how the changing conditions are likely to impact these animals on which we currently rely for a large amount of our seafood. And these kind of assessments on these really large scales were only possible because we had this capability to study the chemistry from space. They've also been used for guiding policy or encouraging sort of focus by policy. This is a pH stripe, so a bit like the temperature stripes you may see on the news. These were used at the most recent climate of parties, the COP presentations, to highlight the plight of the oceans and the change in the pH because of emissions. So in 17 years since my fellowship, there's been a huge range of advances, and now we're getting engagement on these issues from the major space agencies. UNESCO actually have a component within their roadmap for studying ocean carbon that explicitly is focused on supporting satellite observations. And we have support and engagement from NASA, ESA, and the Japanese space agency, JAXA, as well. And CEOS, the international group which guides all international space agencies and industry, is also has a roadmap which we're currently writing that focuses specifically on supporting satellite observations for carbon. And they've asked us to guide them in how they go about that and how they structure that. With my understanding of carbon, I think James kind of briefly mentioned this at the beginning, it's allowed us to actually apply that knowledge to guiding policy within the university. So we have used our understanding of the ocean carbon, but also how it fits globally within global carbon assessments and policy to actually guide how the university responds to the climate emergency. So, for example, we had this piece we published on guiding the university on avoiding carbon offsetting approaches, but we've also given strong guidance on things like the new policy, the travel policy, and more recently on the use of in IT structure and computing. Along with the global focus of my research, I've also focused quite a lot of effort on the near coast zone and in shallower waters. And particularly this started with the focus on food. So these are mussel strings in St Austell Bay, actually, so just off the Cornish coast, where a farmer has laid strings to actually grow mussels for harvesting for food. And they have an issue with growing mussels, where if you get harmful algal blooms actually coming in, of a particular species coming into these waters, they can actually force the closure of the shellfish beds, and therefore they can't harvest or sell their product. So we worked with one of the local farmers to try and understand what was driving the changes in water quality. So this is Vika, one of my former postdocs, and this is the buoy system that she designed. It's a really low-cost buoy system that she's holding up there. And we deployed this in St Austell Bay. And you can see the deployment here. And we use this to characterize the conditions right next to the shellfish farm, so we could then understand and allow us to understand and what was driving the changes in the water quality. We had quite a few problems with this fieldwork. We had a few storms that came through and ripped it up and threw it onto a beach. We had to go and retrieve it. We had a fisherman kidnap the boy at one point and tried to hold it to ransom, and we had to go and collect it again. But we did manage to collect a huge amount of data, and it enabled us to actually produce 1 week forecasts for the water quality and the closure of the shellfish beds. So we could actually forewarn the farmer when the conditions were likely that he was about to have his shellfish beds closed, which meant that he could actually shift his focus to one of his other sites for selling his product. Another area we've particularly started to look at now is the use of drones in the near coast environment. And we started off by, and this is a former PhD student, James, his work focused on studying seagrass beds. So these are environments which are really important nurseries for small fish and animals, but they're also really important stores of carbon. And so we wanted to know, can we use a low-cost drone to actually map these seagrass beds so we can understand whether the conservation efforts, are they growing inside, are they actually decreasing, are they degrading? And so we studied a site in South Wales here, and it turns out you can do it really well from a drone. You can actually identify the algal species on the ground versus the seagrass bed versus sediment, cockles, and differentiate all of those different species. But you can do this at low tide. So this is when the water has actually gone out. This was also, this piece of field work also has one of the best stories, I think, because we were actually lost on our way to one of the field sites. And as we were turning around in the road to head back the other way, a police Land Rover appeared over the brow of the hill. And they obviously decided that we turned round because we'd seen them, because they then followed us down the road and they pulled us over. And then to our surprise, as the armed policeman stood next to us, towering over us, and explained that he was there as part of Operation Protect for the local nuclear power station, he was not very happy when he then discovered that we were about to start flying a drone near his nuclear power station. So we then had this discussion with him, and then we also had to visit the power station to explain what we were up to, so that, and then we could carry on with our fieldwork. But it was a slight diversion to the morning's fieldwork. We've since taken those techniques offshore. So this is us flying a drone just offshore. For anyone that's a Fraggle Rock fan, the lighthouse in the top there is actually the Fraggle Rock lighthouse. But this, from a whole day of field work, this is the only time the drone flew. It flew once. And we have no idea how we managed to get it to fly once, and we couldn't repeat it. It later transpired the problem was that the drone was unable to, it didn't know what was the ground, what was flat and stable, and therefore it refused to take off. The other problem it had was once you collected the data, it didn't know where it was in the air, and therefore it didn't know what it was looking at. And this is a really hard problem to tackle, because essentially normally when people use drones, they use fixed targets on the ground, and that allows them to work out what the drone is actually looking at. Whereas one of my PhD students, who's now one of my postdocs and still in my research group, she worked out how to use the drone and then the drone telemetry, the roll, pitch and yaw of the instrument, to actually project the data onto the ground. And so essentially the yellow line here you can see is what the drone, we worked out from how the drone measurements have been taken, whereas the black line is what you would typically find by collecting surveys on the ground. So they match really well. And this meant for the first time we could actually collect data and project them over the water and have some confidence about the positioning of the camera system and what we were actually looking at. So everything I've said so far I've talked about the environment observed from space, but you can also track objects from space using satellites as well. So this is another PhD project, Julia's. She was studying turtles in the Mediterranean, so these leatherback turtles. And you can see that she's placing a tracker on the top of the turtle there. And this allows you to understand where the animal's going. So if you want to conserve a species, you need to know where it's off to, what it's up to, in some sense, otherwise you can't protect it. But if you then combine those satellite information, that tracking information with stable isotope analysis, you can understand a bit more about what it's actually doing when it's traveling to those spaces. So the isotope analysis requires you to take a tissue sample or a sample from the shell And from that, you can understand a bit about where the animal's been, but also what it's been eating. And this allowed Julia to actually identify that a lot of these turtles from this particular population were heading off to the coast of Tunisia. And this population was actually in decline, despite the fact that it was being there were large amounts of effort trying to conserve it. And the reason was essentially when they all went off to Tunisia, there was a high level of bycatch and boat strikes. And so the animals were actually being killed and harmed as they were heading off to their feeding grounds. So this was a really important piece of work in terms of trying to guide that conservation. So if you want to protect those animals, then you really need to think about where they're heading off to as well. Turtles aren't the only thing that's interested in the movement of water. So over 80% of world trade is conducted via the sea. And so I was part of a group to design a satellite to try and understand the motion of the water. And you can do this in the same way that police use speed guns to track car speeds. So the idea was we proposed that you could take an altimeter, which is a very standard satellite, combine it with a glitter ball or a rotating spinning disc, and then this allowed you to actually measure the Doppler speed, so the change in phase because of a moving object. And over a period of years, we actually had to, we were down selected and we were very close to actually being funded. There was only 2 satellites being considered in this particular competition. We had to design everything from how it was launched, its orbit, as well as prove the measurement technique. We weren't successful, we didn't get funded, but the concept itself is now being developed by NASA and the French Space Agency, and also being developed for 2 different satellites by the European Union and European Space Agency. So the technology advancements are now being exploited. But during that time, it kind of made me think about what is the environmental impact of the rockets, which are, and the exploitation of space assets actually having on the environment. And particularly now we're seeing a really steep increase in the amount of activity in space from industry particularly. And so this prompted me to start a whole new area of work, trying to quantify the impacts that we're having on the upper atmosphere. It turns out from a carbon dioxide point of view, the emissions are really tiny. So launching a rocket vertically up the emissions from carbon is about the same as just flying across the Atlantic once. But the bigger problem is the impacts they're having on the climate directly, and particularly on aluminium. They produce aluminium particles which promote ozone loss. But also the thing we found that was really unique that we hadn't realized before was the fact they're contracting the upper atmosphere. So the rockets themselves are causing the atmosphere to contract, which means any rubbish that's actually in the atmosphere stays up there for a whole lot longer than it would do without that rocket activity. But since then, a whole group of us at the University of Exeter here have expanded this research to try and understand these gains, the balance, and how to balance these gains between being able to access space, but also the impact we're having on the environment. Because clearly there's a need to monitor the environment, but it comes at a cost. In terms of nighttime light for animals that are actually transiting and using the nighttime sky for navigation, particularly for the clusters of satellites which are now being used for internet access. It's disturbing the nighttime light, but also for people who have some sort of spiritual connection to the sky as well. It's disrupting that. But increasingly, debris is becoming an issue, and this is actually every dot you can see on this plot is a piece of actually tracked debris, which is around the upper atmosphere and in low Earth orbit around the Earth. The other thing we've found out most recently, though, is the impacts are also at ground level. And so how the data is stored, distributed, shared, copied, duplicated is also having a major environmental impact. So just to finish on, I wanted to touch upon a new area of work which we've just started within my group. And this again came out of the work from the failed satellite design. So it's like a phoenix from the flames. And this is the concept that what you can see at the ocean surface actually gives you an indication of what's happening at depth at some point below. An example of this is those hurricanes. as we saw those hurricanes whizzing across the Atlantic, one of the reasons why they're actually changing the carbon exchange is because they're acting like a huge hoover. As they go across the ocean, they're actually sucking up a huge amount of water from depth. So in this way, the signature we can see at the surface is actually telling us something about what's happening much deeper down within the water column. And you can apply the same approach to the coast. So if you have a large body of water moving onto the coast and into inland waters, it hits the land acts as some sort of barrier, and there must be a return flow because of mass balance. The water has to go somewhere. And so the signature of the water moving at the surface is actually telling you something about what's happening at depth, that return flow of the water. And we thought that this concept would work, quite well, but we were quite shocked at how well it described the conditions. So it turns out that the chemistry, the water chemistry of these coastal seas is strongly controlled by the flow of water coming from the deep ocean, and it's just the wind-driven component. So it essentially means that if we want to try and save our coastal seas from ocean acidification and the uptake of carbon, and this is the place where over 90% of our seafood comes from, if we want to save those, we actually have to save the global ocean first. Because if we don't do that, essentially we have no control of the surface chemistry of our coastal seas, because it's about the flow of water coming from the global ocean that's really controlling that. So I just wanted to finish on some thank yous. So all these people up here, I'm not going to go through them, but their names, but these are all people who have inspired me or guided me or pushed me in some way over the last 20 years. And in some cases have listened to some of my crazy ideas and politely explained to me why that wouldn't work. And these people are from the States up to Scotland and Orkney, and then down into the southern parts of the UK, but also across Europe. And I'm incredibly grateful for all of their insights and help. And I should also say that all of the work I've been talking about has been funded by the groups you can see across the bottom there. And then I should also say, very last of all, that I need to say thank you to my family, because none of this would have been possible without them, both my wife, Karen, and Polly, my daughter, and Colin, our dog there, you can see at the bottom, looking very stylish. But also my mum and dad, who have supported me throughout my whole of my education and my degree and beyond. My dad's no longer with us. He died a few years ago, but he was really one of the key reasons why I got focused and interested in engineering in the first place. But clearly, my skills in welding was not something that he was particularly proud of. But yeah, I should say thank you. So thank you very much. That's it. Thanks very much.
Questions? You prepared to?
I'm very happy to take questions. Yeah.
Control it. Yeah.
So, did anyone have any questions in the room? Can't see anything coming up on the computer. I'm very happy to answer questions over a glass of wine or beer as well afterwards.
Next, what's your dream next job? What's your dream next research project?
Well, I really enjoy my current job, I have to say. But I do think in terms of advancement, the next thing I think is I suspect that it's possible to actually observe the ions within the water from space. So I think we can go one step further from looking at the chemistry. I think we can actually look at the ions, so from a microscopic scale. And that's really what I think is the next thing I'd like to look at. The deep ocean remote sensing is also really quite exciting. And that's something we're carrying on with, and we think we can quantify the flows of carbon based upon those principles as well. So, but yeah, I definitely enjoy my current job.
I really enjoyed the multidisciplinarity of your career, and I find when you do multidisciplinary research, it can be very difficult to move into new fields and persuade that field that your work is valid to them. I'm curious as to how you made that step from studying gates and persuading the Marine Lab that you could do satellite stuff.
Well, yeah. So the question was about how can you change disciplines effectively and convince people that you know what you're doing. I think they took a bet in some sense on me, but it was also the theory, the understanding, theoretical understanding is consistent. So everything from whether you're talking about electronics or computer vision, it's essentially maths based. And if you're looking at computer vision from a video camera point of view and applying it to satellite observations, the theory, the physics are the same. It's just that instead of only having 10 meters between your camera and your person, you actually have 400 kilometers between your camera effectively and your target. So the theory was all consistent. But I suspect, I was lucky enough that they took a bet on me, essentially. And I'm very grateful that they did.
In electronics, a long time ago, one of the big things we do in electronics is modeling. And we use feedback as part of our modeling. And a lot of people are sort of concentrating on AI, which is actually pretty trivial. The understanding that you get from feedback is enormous. Do you think that's going to pervade your work more?
Yeah, I think so. We've tried to look at some of the work on understanding and exploiting time, particularly with how to feed that signal back into what you're quantifying. But what's interesting is that the international remote sensing communities don't really like it very much. They prefer, or they appear to prefer to focus on purely spectral approaches. But I think that is changing. But it seems to be a less accepted way of doing things, and it's particularly, and it's an example, I think, where satellite observation community aren't really exploiting what's coming from the kind of computer vision or intelligence approaches like that. They're not really exploiting them to the full, and it is an area that's really ripe for exploiting and advancing on. So I think if there's no other questions, I can't see any questions online.
It looked like a couple of things were popping up with people's hands on it.
Here we go. Roberto, did you have a question?
Yes, hello, Jamie and everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Not really a question, but I just wanted to praise your achievements on behalf of all the colleagues at the European Space Agency. We've been happy to be working with you for so many years, as you showed. I've been privileged to be working with you as technical officer for, I think, already 5 or 6 projects. And the ocean carbon from space in all its diversification is here to stay at ESA, so I'm sure we will have the chance to be working together also in the near future for your exciting new endeavors. Congratulations, Professor Jamie.
Thank you, Roberto. It's very kind. So if there's no other questions, I guess hand over to Andy.
Okay. Yeah, it's great to see so many people here. Jamie asked me if I would be prepared to give a thanks on behalf of the university. Can't really speak on behalf of the whole university, but it's been very enjoyable. I've worked with Jamie now certainly since he came to Exeter. A little bit before that, I think we're both alumni of Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and I think amongst the things that Jamie has brought to the university, and I think it was an inspired hiring, frankly, because it has helped to cement a research community in the Southwest, which is focused on the oceans, and it has helped the university to secure its links with Plymouth Marine Laboratory, which has been really excellent. And as James has said, several other, we now have a relationship with PML, which is in some ways like our relationship with the Met Office. We have people who come and go between the two, which is really, really, really good. I've been astonished by your career path, Jamie. I didn't really quite realise all of the things you've done, but I do know from working with him that that Jamie, as he thinks in a different way to most of the marine scientists that I work with. I've done marine science for 30, 40 years. We tended to spend our time on boats, on ships, which is great. You learn a lot about the place where you are, but we have to move to use satellites, because satellites are what shows us the planet as a whole. And if we want to be comfortable in living on this planet as a whole, we have to have that much bigger viewpoint, much wider viewpoint, which Jamie's work gives us. So it's been a pleasure to work with Jamie, and I'm very pleased that he's now a full professor. So and join me in thanking him for